When we talk about the sensory triad, so the sensory triad it's a concept in neurology which explains the different type of reception from the body or sensory reception from the body. So we can break that into sort of three major areas. We have exteroceptive stimuli, so that's from your vision. It could be someone touching you, your skin, something like that. Something coming from the outside is more exteroceptive. Interoceptive is the feedback that your brain gets from the inside of your own body, as such as the vagus nerve sending information to the brain about the state of the gut and the viscera. Now, proprioceptive information is, as we know, is generally to do with movement. So at all times, the brain is picking up exteroceptive, interoceptive, and proprioceptive information at every second to determine whether it's safe, where it is in space, and where it's going to go. So in terms of breathing serves as a constant interoceptive and proprioceptive input to the brain. So what does that mean? So what it means is that, as we know, like we as soon as we're born, we start breathing, breathe air, and we don't stop until we die. So that's just a constant stimulate, a constant sensory barrage up into the brain. So because it's constant and it's the most life-threatening physiological function that we have, if we lose it, the brain is paying so much attention to it. At all times, it's receiving interoceptive information. That's basically the state of respiration, what it's doing, how it's affecting every other system, how is the acid balance, how is the alkaline balance, how much nitric oxide are we delivering into our cells. That's more of the interoceptive side of things, measuring pressures in the arteries and veins. And the proprioceptive side of it is that each breath you take, those breathing muscles, which all carry a vast amount of proprioceptors, are being stimulated every single breath, and that information is being sent back up to the different regions of the brain, which we'll talk about in the next few slides. So this is why dysfunctional breathing patterns, thinking that we breathe 22,000, on average 22,000 breaths a day, dysfunctional breathing patterns can cause a whole heap of stuff in your brain, and it can create a lot of distress for the brain, meaning that the brain is trying to control your body, it's trying to keep you the safest, it's trying to keep you balanced at all times. This is definitely an area that we need to think of, that there's not a moment in time that your nervous system is not paying attention to how you are breathing. So this is why when we change our breathing, we become more conscious of it and we shift it, we can have huge impacts on our state of mind and overall health. Okay. So in our system, the system that I employ, we have a pretty systematic approach to everything. This is a basic look at it, but we prioritize the limbic system, the emotional system at the top, and then we have the interoceptive system, which is all the other homeostatic systems, one of them being respiration. But we could pretty much place respiration as part of the limbic system, really. So the limbic system, being the emotional system, is triggered when there's any threats in the environment or perceived threats. Now, what's the first thing that's going to change when we go on or off? It's going to be breathing. So the breathing system, the respiration system, respiratory system, is directly connected to what's happening in your limbic system, which some people call the monkey mind. So that's the system that is activated when there is a perceived threat. Now, the thing is that it's always activated anyway. Whether it goes into a fight-flight response is determined on how it perceives the stimuli around it. That will then obviously increase the breath rate, heart rate, all that sort of stuff. So there's a direct correlation with those two systems. So that's why I say respiration, breathing, is it at the top? Is it just below? It's probably in between the two. So right up the top. So we can use that as both an assessment and a treatment in order to change our limbic response, which then has a flow-on effect with all these other systems that are below it. As you can see, when over on the left there, it's talking about interoceptive. So interoceptive constitutes 80% of the feedback going to the brain, whereas down below, the exteroceptive is about, well, exteroceptive and proprioceptive is about 20%. So when we change that interoceptive feedback, it's a big bang for buck kind of approach. Okay. Now, when we go into motor development, so I talked about motor development quite a bit in my last webinar on how the brain maps movement. And we looked at this chart here, how movement develops from most primitive to most athletic, essentially. And look at what's at the top. It's breathing. So breathing is the first movement. It's the first thing we do. And it's coupled with our primitive reflex actions. It can have an impact on eye tracking, and we'll have a look at this later. We'll look at the sphenoid bone and how that impacts position of the eyes. And then that just feeds into all these other more complex and integrated movements. So by changing your breathing, you can literally change any one of these movements that are flowing up the path. So that's a pretty critical thing to look at. Now, with breathing neurology, there's a lot to it. However, there are some key areas that are involved in terms of unconscious respiration, which is most of the time. It's really living in this sort of pons and medulla area. We have the pontine respiratory group. In the medulla, we also have what's called the ventral respiratory group. And then we also have the dorsal respiratory group. So dorsal will be more primitive, and that is more related to the sort of freeze response. So we can go into a threat response and we can become a bit more primitive in our breathing. It may stop or freeze. And whereas the nucleus ambiguous, which is also part of the medulla, is more the regulation of breath rate and range. So it's really this lower part of the brain in the brainstem that is controlling most of the unconscious breathing, which is most of the time. However, it does have a communication with it into the hypothalamus, the cortex, the frontal cortex brain. The midbrain's just above the pons, and lots of other areas, as we'll see in the next slide. So there's just breathing affects every part of the brain, but there are some key areas that we know this is like the house or the nuclei of where breathing is initiated. So big key area is probably the medulla, the pons and the medulla, but particularly the medulla. Now look at where the medulla is. It's just above, it's just literally the top of the spinal cord. Could almost be considered like a part of the spinal cord, but it does most of the most important functions in the body. So if there's any damage to that area, if you have any whiplash, if you have a head trauma, if you have upper cervical impacts, this area is going to be impacted and can have a descending effect on respiration. As we look at this on the right-hand image there's a diagram of what's called the phrenic nerve. Now, the phrenic nerve is the nerve that actually innervates the diaphragm itself, the diaphragm muscle. Now, the diaphragm muscle is the key to breathing, but there are many other components to breathing which make up the whole picture. So as we can see on that right-hand picture, we have the phrenic nerve. Now that comes out of C345. As they say when you're learning anatomy at school, and they're saying C345 keeps you alive. So any damage to those segments can impact how the nerve flow, the nerve conduction down into the diaphragm is happening. So we're going to do a technique later on, but then it's an osteopathic technique that you're going to do on yourself if you need to be able to basically release or activate the phrenic nerve, which is really cool. Now, on the phrenic nerve as well, some people have said that's a nerve that's related to this severe life threat or even is activated when someone dies. So it's a really key survival area. There's a bit of the breathing neurology there. So what are some of the other areas that are affected by the areas of the brain that are affected by breathing? It's all these areas here. So the primary motor cortex, we also call that M1, primary sensory cortex, the supplementary motor area, the frontal lobe. So the anterior cingulate, it's a key suffering area involved in pain and anxiety. The superior temporal gyrus, so that's more to do with memory. The insula, that's the key interoceptive area of the brain. The thalamus is like the relay station. It coordinates all the different sensory and motor tracts. The basal nuclei, that's the motor, essentially houses all our motor functions. Yeah, the midbrain, the pons, the medulla, and the cerebellum as well. Now, in terms of a particular part of the cerebellum, it's actually the middle of the cerebellum, which is receiving feedback from the rib cage, contracting and expanding. So that's mechanoreceptive or proprioceptive input is coming in from the rib cage up into the middle of the cerebellum. And the cerebellum controls all other motor function. It basically corrects errors in the sensory motor system, not just physical, but even mental. It has a role in coordination of thought as well. So I thought I'd put that engineer's diagram of the different brain networks there. So basically, breathing is very good for the brain. And if it's not done properly, it can be really bad. So let's just summarize that.